The proceeding will start shortly.
Women and Equalities Select Committee and part of our inquiry into misogyny in music. Can I thank our witnesses this afternoon for coming along to give evidence? We have Vick Bain, founder of the F List for Music, Mel Kelly, Mel or Melinda? Thank you. Volunteer and member of management team at Safe Gigs for Women, Nadia, the founder of Women in Control, and Vanessa Threadgold, founder and managing director of Cactus City Studio. Questions will come to you from the members of the committee in turn, and we'll usually indicate which witness it is that we wish to answer. Can I, if at any point any of you wish to come in, please do raise your hand, and the committee member will bring you in at an appropriate moment. Can I start with Vick, please, and some questions about lyrics, particularly lyrics that I'm going to use the word celebrate violence against women and girls. And your 2019 report, Counting the Music Industry, found that 80% of record label artists are male. Does that account for the prevalence of misogynistic lyrics, or are there other motivations, causes to that?
I certainly believe so, and in fact the percentage of songwriters of female songwriters is even fewer. So 14% of musicians who are signed to UK music publishing companies as composers or songwriters are women. So with such a huge dominance of men as both songwriters and as musicians, the songs they create are going to be from a male viewpoint.
Thank you. So because it's topical, it's going to be inevitable that I ask you about this. Delilah, is there an issue with music where people don't necessarily listen to the lyrics, have no consciousness of what they are? We all knew the chorus, we hadn't perhaps until last week started looking at the content. And what can we do about that?
Well, I many years ago met the writers of Delilah, and according to them, this was a sort of a part of a great tradition of folk songs, which are around the abuse and murder of women. That's not something that is particular to my taste, and again is because there's such a prevalence and dominance of male songwriters. Now in the 1960s it was even more male dominated. I think that we need the music industry to sign more women, to invest in more female musicians, and then we will have songs of a different nature.
Has there been any research done to indicate that women write different types of lyrics, and is it quantifiable?
I would have to get back to you on that particular point, but I certainly know in my own personal experience of women who write songs is that they write songs about parenthood, having children, not having children. They're writing songs with song content from a much more female-orientated standpoint.
And what can be done about the lack of within the industry? How can we encourage the record companies, the labels, to look at promoting female talent, to foster and encourage female songwriting talent?
Well, I think before I published Counting the Music Industry in 2019, no one really knew just how bad the problem was. And the fact that I analysed over 300 music publishing companies and record labels and looked at their rosters and did that analysis, no one had done that before. So I think it surprised the music industry just how bad it was. Now, I think if you speak to women in music, we all say, well, I knew that. But having the data, having the research and the statistics is vitally important.
Thank you. And because he was a very prominent face of the It's a Tradition in Folk Music defence, I listened to what Threadgold Sharkey was saying about, look, this is just a traditional style of music. Has it got any better since then? How, is somebody going to come to me with the defence that rap and grime artists are just using traditional folk music as their inspiration?
I've not heard that argument.
No, I mean, I just think, do you think there's any sign of it getting better, or is it actually getting worse? If we accept that Delilah is a song of the 1960s, 60s, 70s, I don't know, my childhood, not...
With the 60s, yeah.
are lyrics better now? Are they less misogynistic, or is it worse?
I don't know. I've not done that analysis. I'm sure that there is research out there which has maybe done a decade by decade analysis, but I don't know of it.
Nadia, you were nodding at that. Do you have any thought? Excuse me, whilst we have the
lighting.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
I guess my view on misogynistic lyrics is that I think that they're so prevalent and so widespread in popular music, and I would say, actually, I've seen some research to show that it's not just in specific genre, that popular music has over a third of misogynistic lyrics, and my view is that it's actually a representation of societal views and societal norms, and it's a reflection of the misogynistic culture that is apparent within the society, but also within the music industry and the structures that women have to work with. Leaning into some of the Vick's data, talking about 80%. Women in Control also did a study looking into the breakdown of the top 100 most played songs on radio over the period of a year, and we found similar results to say that there were 18% of female songwriters credited and non-binary artists credited as songwriters, only 2.6% of producers credited. And a really interesting stat that came out of that as well was that male artists featured on 81% of all records. And I found a really interesting feature that was written in BBC News that had looked back over a decade, looking at how many women solo artists there were appearing in the charts. And it's a really interesting exercise to do, because what has been tracked with this data is that women artists are having to collaborate, or their vocals are being used on male-led records in order for them to have chart success. So we can think of examples in dance music where there are more producer-led campaigns. I think Becky Hill is a great example of this. In the press, she was spoken as the most unknown pop star, where her songs were played at festivals and everybody was singing them, but they didn't know who she was. Another great example is a vocalist called Kelly Lee, and her vocals were used, I think it was a Jax Jones song, I can't remember the name of the song, and she was just paid a session musician fee to re-sing a Whitney vocal, and that song blew up, was a huge record, and she didn't get any future royalties from that, but also her name was not credited. So I think it's also an issue about using women's vocals, and in terms of just the content within lyrics and is out there. Obviously, if there are majority songs that are being put out from a male perspective, we are losing that women's perspective in the narrative behind songs that are being put out there. And I always like to bring it back to, in the population, women are 51%, but in the music industry, it feels like we're talking about women as though we're talking about a niche genre or a specialist subject. Oh, can we get support for this minority? Which isn't the case. And I think, what Vick said, I think is very true. I often speak of her research and reports in the conversations I'm having, because it seems like there's almost a veil over the industry where we're going along, where women that work in the industry, we're fully aware of these issues, but without the data, we're not taken seriously, and there's no conversation being had about it.
Can we have a conversation about something else topical? I might ask all of the panel if they want to comment on it. So you've just made some comments almost about the invisibility of women. Talk to me about Best Artist Awards, and whether that helps or hinders women. Should there still be Best Female Artist at the Brits?
I think, from the Brits' perspective, it was probably done with the intention of improving inclusivity. I think it's an idealistic viewpoint, and I personally don't think that we're ready or we're there yet.
How can you be if there's 25% artists are women?
Exactly. So I think it's also about talking about eligibility criteria. I know it's a voting academy, so I know that there were 70 artists that were eligible for this award category, and I know out of the 70, 12 were women. But when it was put out to the voting academy, they didn't choose 5 women for the shortlist. And I also think that leans in again. I think we're talking about a music industry that is in a vicious cycle. You know, there's not one person or one place to pinpoint the blame. Vick's research looking at the representation of women in record labels, 19%, and in publishers, 14%. PRS for Music have they're a collection society for songwriters and composers. They have 160,000 members. Of that, only 18% are women. And that number has risen dramatically in the last 3 or 4 years. I think it was something like 13 or 14% only a few years ago. We obviously know about the women aren't getting booked for live shows, for promoters aren't booking them for live events. And I work as a manager in the industry, and I've had conversations with people that are booking or playing listing on radio or A&Rs, and I've had conversations where I've been told artists don't test well on radio, so therefore we're not going to program them. They get skipped more by DSP platforms on streaming platforms, and therefore the algorithm negatively affects them and they move down playlists or removed completely. And with labels, if you're going in and I'm taking an artist in to pitch them, the conversation is very much driven towards, well, what do they look like? Or, oh, we've already got a woman signed. How is she different? And there's also often this comparison. And again, just before I close, just going back to that study that we did looking at the top 100 artists and the breakdown of that. I think there's something I've seen called dubbed the Adele effect. And again, going back to the Brits, I think with the fact that Dua Lipa and Adele did not release albums within the eligible time period, it kind of takes the mask away to say, oh, do you know what, actually, where are the women artists? So it's kind of been dubbed the Adele effect, where it gives the impression of, again, I feel like I'm being gaslit multiple times a day of my career in the music industry when I'm talking to people and telling them this, and they're saying, what are you talking about? Adele's massive, or Dua Lipa's huge. If you go through the charts and count how many unique women artists are there, it's only a handful, because only a select few are allowed to get through to that next level.
Thank you. Mel, did you want to add anything on that?
That's outside my area. So
okay, thank you. Vanessa, did you have any comment?
So, from my perspective, it's very easy to look at the things that the general public which will look at, such as festival lineups and the charts. But actually, we see the problem lying in the barriers to entry to the music industry. So, around equal gender split enter the industry at the very start. But the environment is set up in a way that is actually very unwelcoming to women, whether that be from a childcare perspective or just from the nature of the sexual harassment and the sexualisation and misogyny that's present. So it creates an environment where people don't want to stay in the industry because it's just generally just unpleasant to be there, or just you're a class token or a novelty, and you're not taken seriously as Nadia was speaking about. So that then creates a landscape where behind the scenes you have more men at every level moving up the ladder within career, and they're the people that make the decisions. Therefore, just from their natural bias and prejudice, they often go to men because they feel that it's easier for them to work with people who look like them and people who sound like them. So that's actually where we see the problem starting, and that's where, from our organisational perspective, we like to look at the root causes of these problems. And the recording studio is one of those spaces where women aren't spoken to when they enter the room. That's actually a really common problem, where they're just ignored because they're maybe perceived as a girlfriend or a groupie, and men have told us that they don't speak to the women just in case they are the girlfriend of the man that's present, in case they then react badly. So it's still the same problem that we're all facing. We're facing this awful issue of violence against women and girls, but also the toxic masculinity that's present. And if we're talking about places like the recording studio and education for that very beginning stage of your career, if that is such a toxic and difficult environment to exist in, most people aren't going to stay in that industry, and they're going to leave, and then it becomes much of a fight and to stay in the industry. And we often look at the landscape and think it's actually not a nice landscape to be in, and people ask us, why do we stay here? It's because we actually love making music and we love creating. So we're trying to make kinder and more gentle environments that are actually suitable for women to exist in, but that's very difficult to do when we're fighting against something that has existed in its current state for so long. And also, we're also fighting against the the perception that people are lucky to work in the industry, so you're then expected to accept the treatment that's there. So you're lucky to be here, so therefore you should expect this to happen to you because you've got a great position. So there's that sort of smoke and mirrors of the glamour of it, when it's actually not that glamorous behind the scenes. And I'm sure many women who work in the industry will tell you that is a very difficult job, and there's a lot of work that goes into it. And often people work for a very long time for free to be in the industry, and that's another part of the nature of the exploitativeness of it. And that means that people who can work on low-paid roles, when you're in a role at a label, if you look at a role that's the same at potentially a bank, you're looking at being paid 50%. So say if you work in the finance department, you're going to be paid 50% of what you paid elsewhere. So therefore, people who are from a low socioeconomic background might not be able to actually enter the industry. So it creates all these other barriers as well. And that's what creates this male dominance within it.
Thank you.
Kim.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, panel. My first question is to you, Vanessa. You've just spoken about the role of women in the recording studio. I also want to know what you can say about the barriers that women face in music production and what needs to be done to break that barrier.
It really is. It is the perception that women can't do the job. It's a lot of getting men on board. We ask them to be more proactive. So with our organisation, we've created a charter of good practice where we're actually asking studios, people who work in studios, to be more proactive in understanding that actually women are facing these barriers, and we shouldn't have to be the ones who are constantly fighting. They should join us in that fight if they care about women's rights and women's safety, and create more safe environments. That's one of the things that we're actually asking people to do. It can be quite difficult, actually, and one of the reasons being is that sometimes studios tell us that as there's so many freelancers that work in the space, they don't want to be responsible for the actions that they're perpetrating within the studios. So they sometimes say we can't sign up to this because actually we feel like we'll lose business from people who are here in our studios to create a party environment or a more casual working environment, and want to take advantage of that. So it is difficult from that sense, but from our perspective we try and look at things from a positive viewpoint, in that if we can point people in the direction of these spaces that are happy to make their spaces safer, then we're able to draw more attention to these kind of places, and we can take people out of their bedroom studios, because many women learn to produce themselves rather than having to go into studio environments. They set up at home, and there's thousands of content creators now creating recording studio content online, which is great. It's amazing for creativity, but it's not so great when we're looking at collaborating, and it's not so great when we're looking at actually learning things on the job and getting into the industry at, I suppose, a more professional level. So we want to be able to bring people...
Sorry, Vanessa. I think you make a really important point there about training, and I think for more women to get into the business. So I was thinking that careers advice and guidance, and talking to women to say this is possible. If somebody was going to a school and says, well, I'm involved in music production, this is how it works, this is how you get on, these are the contacts. And I think, because the industry isn't developed in that way, it kind of has those barriers. So I think looking at opportunities to train, and I don't know whether any of that work currently takes place, going into schools and being involved in careers guidance in terms of the art and cultural sector, particularly in the backroom section of art and culture.
It does take place for sure, but it's difficult. People say it's difficult to find female tutors, but actually I don't think it is. I just think that the networks aren't connected. So that is something that we are looking at. We're actually building a database of producers on top of building a database of studios. And there's also something called 2% Rising, which is a great database of, this is a collective of female and non-binary producers that all work together and help each other with work. So it is really sometimes just drawing attention to these things.
Thank you very much for answering those questions. Vanessa, Nadia, how does the gender imbalance in senior leadership contribute to the misogynistic culture in the industry?
This is an issue that I've spoken widely on and done some reporting on as well, just looking at the underrepresentation of women in senior leadership roles. I did a report with Women in Control called Seat at the Table, which looks at the representation of women in the boardrooms across the UK music trade bodies who represent different organisations representing composers, producers, managers, major labels, independent record labels, etc. And overall, the findings were that there were only 34% of women holding board seats, and obviously that's just an average across those organisations. Some organisations had more equal parity. Some other organisations were leaning down, where they only had one woman sitting on a board of 16 seats, or 3 women sitting on a board of 27 seats. My view is that definitely is a leading cause of a lot of the misogynistic views, and that is still consistently going on in the industry, because we don't have the gatekeepers and the decision makers at the top who are women. I think there's a big issue around the gender pay gap in the industry as well, which I'd like to share some stats on as well, if possible. The Universal Music in 2021 reported a gender pay gap of 29%, and in 2022, 31%. Warner Music in 2021 reported a gender pay gap of 30%, and in 2022 that rose to 36%, or nearly 37%. Sony Music in 2021 reported a gender pay gap of 25%, and in 2022 that rose to 27%. Currently, it's only mandatory for organisations over the size of 250 employees to report their gender pay gap, and as Vanessa pointed out, there are over 70% of the workforce is made up of freelancers, so it is quite challenging for us to access this data, but it is really frustrating to see this data released year on year and those numbers aren't improving. And I think the gender pay gap is a direct insight into where the leadership lies within some of the bigger organisations. I would like to see more salary transparency around organisations, and I think having had conversations with smaller companies or freelancers to understand the challenges that organisations that are not of that size have with putting their reporting together. I know the UK Music Diversity 10-point plan recommended that organisations over the size of 50 start to do the gender pay gap reporting and ethnicity pay gap reporting. However, there are challenges for smaller organisations, and I feel that salary transparency, and there are a list of recommendations that Women of Control have put together that I would like to submit to the panel in writing afterwards, about a simple way that organisations can take something like releasing salary when they're putting out job adverts that can really help to eliminate the gender pay gap and ensure that women are also getting fairly paid the same for the same jobs and roles as their male equivalents.
I'll just interject on that. Is there a challenge around salary and gender pay gap reporting when so many in the industry are freelance? Is it just going to mask the figures?
Yes, there is a challenge with the smaller companies, but for freelancers, potentially there could be a framework, because research has shown that when women are asked for their freelance rates and versus men asking for their freelance rates, they go in at a lower rate. And it does feel, obviously it's called the music business, so everyone's always trying to undercut, and unfortunately the women are often at the brunt end of this deal, and as well as women of colour who have to face the discrimination twice. So I think, there's definitely there's solutions around it, but it is a challenge. Yes, it is a challenge with smaller companies.
We're back to you, Kim. Thank you.
Thanks, John. But Nadia, there is a perception that women will play an integral role in the business because of their involvement, but it isn't. So what do you think needs to happen to improve more diverse representation?
I think that all organisations need to do an internal review and look at their own diversity, look at the diversity in their leadership teams. There are simple steps that companies can take, when I said about salary transparency, but again, having more women in the leadership, around the table is going to bring more women's perspectives and lived experiences into consideration. There's a lack of women in your rosters, then look at hiring more women A&Rs, or look at making that a dedicated target that you're going to work on. We've just launched, and we're about to launch the recruitment for apprenticeship places in the music industry. That's a collaboration that Women in Control have done with AIM and also Amazon Music, who are a streaming platform that have identified this pipeline issue and want to actively do something about it. So we're bringing 6 apprenticeship places into place to support independent labels and giving them an investment towards their salary as well, and providing the training, tapping into the government apprentice levy as well, and specifically tasking these apprentices with getting involved in supporting and championing women and non-binary talent on rosters, and also supporting that output as well. So there are simple things that organisations can do if there is a will to do it, but it feels like a very vast problem when you talk about the issues being so prevalent across every sector. It feels really overwhelming at times, and I just think every organisation needs to take accountability. And if they're not going to, then there needs to be quotas put in place. As women's organisations, we struggle to get funding, we struggle to get the resources for Vick to do that report and sit and work through 300 labels. We're taking our own time to do these reports, and we're not getting funding for it. And no one listens to the findings as well, so we're constantly banging on people's doors. So if people aren't going to listen and take accountability, like I said, maybe there needs to be quotas in place for tracking on radio. I know the BBC have the 50-50 project, and they've created a tracker that with Stanford University, and potentially that's something that could be put into. I don't think, given the chance that the industry has had, that they're able to solve this problem themselves at the minute. It needs to be a collective action from all areas of the industry.
Thanks, and I think, the apprenticeship scheme, I think, is a really positive example of where change can start taking place. So thank you for sharing that information with me. Next question to Vick. Many organisations in the industry fail to support women with issues like maternity. What impact does this have, and what could the government and industry do to improve this?
Well, I've experienced this myself. Back in 1999, I was working for a music company, but I was on a temporary contract. I became pregnant, had twins, immediately lost my job, and certainly didn't get any maternity cover. So having experienced this, I know that this is a big problem. And one of the other boards that I do, that I act as a trustee on Parents and Carers in Performing Arts, does specific research into this and how creative organisations can better support the parents within their workforce. So there is research going on. There are models that organisations can do to bring in more flexible working. But I think it's clear that stopping maternity discrimination should be a very high priority, no matter what industry you work in, and also better childcare. I don't know if I'd be able to get back into work now, when I was able to 20 years ago, because there was more state nursery provision. I was very fortunate to live within a catchment area and get my children into state nursery when they were about 2 years old. I understand that those places have long gone now. So, I think there's a lot more that the music industry can do to better support women getting back into work, but also things that government can do as well.
Thanks, Vick. I'm the mother of twins also, so I appreciate the difficulty it went to. But I think you've all alluded to the fact that a lot of women tend to be working on their own and not in organisations, but it's about how do women access information about their rights. And I was going to ask whether you thought music unions, was a way and means of helping support women in some of those issues that you've just raised, Vick.
Yes, I'm president of another organisation called the Independent Society of Musicians, which has over 11,000 members. It's actually the only membership organisation in music which has a majority female membership. And the legal team there is fantastic. They've got 6 in-house lawyers who work on cases all of the time. And I would strongly recommend that if anyone was, not just a musician but a music professional, if they need to get legal advice, I tell everyone go look at the ISM. And I know that there are other organisations who look after other disciplines and job specialisations as well. So even if they don't have in-house lawyers, they might be able to pass, make a recommendation to a law firm, which can do some pro bono.
Thanks, Vic. Thanks, Chair.
Kate.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. Welcome to all of you. If I can ask my first question to Nadia, please. A lot of the music industry is made up of smaller companies, and kind of leading on a similar theme from Kim's questions. A lot of them don't have HR departments. I just wondered if you could tell us the effect that has on women's ability to report on misogyny.
Yeah, it's very challenging for women working alone. I'd like to share some of my own experiences. First of all, I've been working in the music industry for over 20 years. I primarily work as a music manager, and many music managers work independently in silos by themselves, or they may work with a smaller group of other managers in smaller companies. During my career, over the period of my career, I have experienced bullying, harassment. I've been undermined constantly, and I have, of varying different levels, I have felt invisible when I've walked into rooms, being perceived or deemed to be just an assistant or a groupie. I've been kicked off festival stages while my artist is on stage performing because the security doesn't believe that I could be the manager. I have been laughed away by bouncers at the front of shows who haven't believed that I'm the manager. And as I said, I've done this job for nearly over 20 years, and I guess about a decade into my career, it really had an impact on me. A lot of these things are unconscious bias-led, where people can't deem that, I guess, a younger woman would be taking up a position of authority. Many times, indeed, I might have had a male counterpart standing beside me, or somebody that I'm training, and people will go directly to them and assume that they're the manager. And this still happens to me today. As an independent manager, I am working with independent artists. I will be the video commissioner. I will be the one setting the budgets, booking all the crew, and I'll walk into the video set, and it still happens. It happened about a month ago to me. I walk in and somebody says, "Oh, are you the stylist, or are you the makeup artist, or are you the extra?" And I get ushered, and I have to correct them and say, "No, I'm the manager." And this happens all the time. And it's not something that I get offended about on a daily basis, but it does chip away at your confidence. And I think, like Vanessa touched on, it's like we're almost kind of told in this industry, you should be grateful for your position. I'm having a successful career. I'm doing the perks of the job. I'm lucky to be going into these festivals, getting backstage access, going to these parties and going to all these award shows. But the reality of it is it's really damaging, and it really chips away at your confidence, which is what led me to start up Women in Control. And the saddest thing about starting up Women in Control was that I wanted to have really honest conversations with other women, and after being quiet and silenced and feeling ashamed about my own experiences, pretty much every woman that I'd spoken to had the same experiences, and there was nowhere to turn. In terms of other freelancers, and it is really challenging. Maybe you might be working as a PR person, and you have one client, and they might give you 3 or 4 different avenues of business. If there's a breakdown of that relationship with that client, you have to make the decision, do I just let things slide, or do I bring this up, or who do I report it to? And a lot of women also come to me, and when they've come to Women in Control, they may have already exhausted all the other avenues open to them, and it's really frustrating because they have done all the right steps. They have reported. Again, in my own incident where I was sexually harassed after an event, I woke up after an event, and somebody was on top of me trying to take my clothes off. This is somebody that works in the industry. This is somebody that I then had to be around multiple times. When I tried to bring it up in terms of confronting that person with the group, all I got was an apology and a denial to say, "No, I just came in to say goodbye." And I didn't want to burn the bridge because this person has a spot on radio, or I'm going to see them again at events. So you have to weigh it up in a decision and say, well, what's the right business choice for me to make? How am I going to ensure that I pay my bills? There aren't accurate methods of reporting. And unfortunately, I mean, we did a report looking at women in radio. We spoke to over 100 women that work in radio as their main job at BBC, Bauer and Global and some of the community stations. And nobody would give us statements with their name attached because everyone is scared to speak out. They don't want to face the repercussions. And those people that have spoken out, their careers are negatively impacted because of it as well.
Can I add something there, please?
I'm going to ask you a question along very similar lines, if I can come back to you in a minute. Nadia, first of all, thank you for sharing that very personal information with us. Unfortunately, you know, we see similar across a lot of industries, including in this place, I have to say. Vanessa, if I can move to you, and if this doesn't cover what you were going to say, then please go on to say whatever you were going to say before. I wanted to ask you how significant the risk is of losing out, of career progression, etc. How significant is it in dissuading women from reporting misogyny in the first place?
I don't just think it's the most significant issue just for women. I actually think it's an issue for men as well. So the economic threat, the threat of losing your job, losing your income, doesn't just impact the women in the industry, it impacts everyone. So that helps maintain the silence within the space. And again, when we have this nature of that you are very lucky to be here, therefore you should accept this, it happens to all of us. It's not just to women, and it also stops men from speaking about it, speaking about their colleagues, doing anything about it. And you will be perceived as someone who's causing trouble and you don't just disregarded. And often we see it in all industries where people get themselves into a position of power to be able to, unfortunately, take advantage of that, whether they had that intention in the first place or whether that is just an opportunistic thing that happens at the end of it. It does happen a lot, and it is, you know, we see the economic element of it as being the strongest factor in why people won't report things. There's the general societal, cultural issues of feeling like you won't be believed, feeling like people won't do anything about it, and that impacts us all, but within the music industry is that economic threat.
Thank you. And your written submission mentioned incidents where major labels didn't allow employees to take part in panels on combating inequalities. How widespread is that?
So it's difficult because they always have to go to legal often. Depending on the position that they're in, often people can come and be on a novel panel if you aren't talking about in-depth issues. But if you're talking about something in-depth, then most people aren't allowed to speak on certain panels. They may not be allowed to speak to certain organisations at all. We often exist in, I suppose, whisper groups, which is the unconventional way of us trying to protect each other. And, you know, I don't like to speak for everyone because I really feel that protecting people is a big part of my job. But that is something that is a widespread issue.
Thank you. Mel, you were nodding. Did you want to come in?
Well, my work is primarily with audiences and not with people who are involved in the industries. But in our work with women who have suffered sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual violence, at live music events, it is exactly that same thing. These whisper groups, everybody knows that it happens, but nobody wants to say anything. They don't want to be seen as whining or complaining, or, you know, maybe I did drink too much, or maybe this other thing did happen to me, and it's my fault. And there's very few voices out there who will stand up and go, actually, you know what, it's not right, and it's not your fault, and want to bring these out into the open. We've had real success in the last sort of few years getting people talking about, sexual violence in crowds at live music events. But it's the same problem. You know, every woman that I have spoken to has had something along that lines happen to them, be they a professional, a tour manager. You know, I interact with a lot of tour managers, a lot of merch people, a lot of crew, and they will say, oh yeah, you know, this happens, and everybody knows that guy that behaves that way. But there's sort of from the industry down to the audience, there doesn't seem to be any will to sort of combat that and bring it out of these little sort of, talking amongst each other that happens, because nobody's sort of brave enough to take that first step.
Thank you. Yes, Vick.
So can I also just come in and say, actually, I believe that there's a misuse of non-disclosure agreements as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So not only are women not brave enough to step forward,
Mm-hmm.
they legally can't.
Mm-hmm.
So I co-authored a report last year with the ISM, the Dignity at Work 2 report, which had 660 responses from both men and women, but majoritively women, most of whom were had experienced sexual harassment, and 10% of those respondents had signed some sort of settlement agreement, which goes hand in hand with a non-disclosure agreement. So you're going to have trouble having people coming forward to to be able to say what's happened to them because they are gagged.
Yeah. And just to be clear, when I say brave enough, I mean the big companies, the Warners and all of that, haven't been brave enough to sort of tackle that within themselves. I don't mean the women themselves aren't brave enough to do anything.
Okay, thank you. Vanessa, if I can come back to you. Do you think there's a lack of awareness of the support organisations that are available to women, and do you think that's due to a lack of investment in them?
So when we ask our community and we reach out to them and ask them to tell us of the organisations they're aware of, most of them aren't actually aware of any support at all. Mm-hmm. There is support out there, it's general and it's vague and it covers all musicians, but there's nothing specific to women in regards to support for this, and investment is the biggest problem. So our organisation, we are set up to help women break down barriers and also deal with coming back into the music industry after they've experienced bad behaviours in safer spaces. But the majority of our funding comes directly from us, so we personally put the money in to make this happen. And we often see organisations do projects which are great big PR projects, say we're going to create these 100% women albums, or we're going to do this 100% women lineup, which is great for representation, but it doesn't actually help with the root problems and the problems behind the scenes. And unfortunately, I think the cost of it is probably underestimated as well. So there definitely isn't a investment into it. And I think it's a vicious cycle of if you invest into this issue, you're going to give people their voice back, and people don't want people to have their voice back, because if you actually help people through these issues, they are able to talk about them. They're able to talk about them in a way that feels coherent and it doesn't feel like it's rambling to people. So people are taken seriously at that point, and that's where people don't want to invest, where the industry potentially doesn't want to invest. So people are able to discuss these issues, because we would see a Me Too for the music industry, which we always talk about scratching the surface of the Me Too for the industry, hasn't quite happened yet. And unfortunately, as the majority of the panel have said, every single woman we speak to has had a similar or the same experience, almost to a point where we don't need to speak about it anymore. They just understand why we do what we do. So the investment is a huge problem. We see it's a huge problem. The lack of resources is huge, and it creates this environment where often the organisations, which are all doing incredible work and different roles as well, because you need a holistic circle of support around these issues that look at different issues and focus on different issues, they are fighting for the same pots of funding, when actually everyone needs to be funded to do the different parts of the, to fund the different parts of the solution that needs to happen.
Yeah, and certainly kind of think about the music industry being a multi-million or billion-pound industry. It certainly suggests that it's, isn't just simply a case of the finance not being available when the industry has so much money. It's just choices. And if I move on to you, Vick, and kind of picking up on those points, how willing do you think the music industry is in wanting to combat misogyny? Not very. I pause because, of course, there are good people out there wanting to do good things, and I think we've all worked with various music organisations over the years who are doing a little bit, but as everyone has said,
for instance, on the FList website, I've got a page of what I call sister organisations. There's nearly 70 campaigns, initiatives, not-for-profit organisations, passion projects, which mainly women in music are running, mainly based in the UK, and looking at all sorts of intersectional aspects of diversity as well. I would take a guess that probably 95% of us are self-funding those initiatives. I would love the music industry to properly support and work with us, because we have the solution.
Yeah.
We're doing that work. Yeah. We're doing campaigning on behalf of female musicians. We know who those musicians are. You know, we've got our own directories of musicians and producers and women in music. We're doing training, but we're doing it because we believe in this and we're funding it.
Yep.
There's tiny little bits of projects which are, being funded. We were lucky enough to run a project last year with Help Musicians and Moloko Studios, getting women into professional recording studios with all female production teams, which was fantastic. But it was only for 4 weekends a year. I'm hoping that they're going to continue it next year. So it's very ad hoc. We need some proper support from the music industry to step forward and say, look, we want to work with you because we are here and willing and able to offer solutions.
Yeah, and already doing it, as you say. So I think it's around 70% the workforce, if you like, are freelancers, and more vulnerable. So what degree are the freelancers, and they've already touched on this, more vulnerable to misogynistic abuse compared to employees?
It's a huge problem. In fact, for musicians, the statistic is even higher. It's over 80%. The ONS labour force survey show 83% of musicians are freelance. And even if they do have some sort of contract, not everybody does in writing, it's unclear, I think, whether they fall under the protection of the Equalities Act. So we'd really like to see that clarified. We'd really like freelance musicians who are signed to record labels and record label deals or other sorts of freelance contracts in music to have the scope of protection widened, because these freelance workers need protection too. Or even if they do have some protection, maybe they're not aware. They're not aware that they have these rights, and the people who are employing them are maybe unaware that they have responsibilities over those freelancers as well. So there's a lot of work to be done in educating everyone.
So where the freelancers are aware, how difficult is it for them to report instances of misogyny?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
So how difficult is it for freelancers to report misogyny when they're aware that they have rights?
Well, they should get some legal advice straight away as soon as possible, because the window for them to be able to take action is so, I think it's 3 months, is very soon. They might not even understand at first that they have been, experienced harassment or discrimination, but say that they do and they go get some advice. Well, then they can have, they can make an informed decision then on what pathways are available to them. If they decide to take legal action, as we've talked before, that's a really big step, because this is a small, informal, networked industry that relies on reputation. Yeah. And in the Dignity at Work 2 report last year, 3/4 of people who had experienced harassment or discrimination decided not to report, because if they do, they might not get work again. We certainly had lots of people saying that. They wouldn't. They simply would ruin their reputation. They would be victim blamed, and they would get a reputation for being a troublemaker.
Great.
Okay. Thank you for answering my questions, Chair.
Thanks, Caroline. Just picking up on some of those questions, I just wanted to know from panel what role that you think that music streaming platforms have in identifying and raising awareness of these issues, and whether any of those streaming platforms are undertaking any of this work at the moment? So like Spotify and all of that.
I mean, from our perspective, we've tried to make contact with some of the big streaming platforms, so that we can promote our work with their audiences, and we have not had any success with that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've reached out to them certainly, and perhaps it's just a matter of, they're a very big company and maybe we didn't know who to reach out to. But I think probably unanimously here, it's nothing. Yeah.
Again, large companies making large amounts of money, that should be investing in terms of challenging some of these issues. But maybe that's something that we could pick up on. Anyway, thanks. Go on, sorry.
If I could just add something quickly, we do work with some of the big names in music, and often we feel like, because we're front of house facing, we feel like that we're their badge of, look, we did a thing, we're looking after people, we're looking after their sexual safety, and like I don't want to denigrate that's great that we can work with these very young people often at live music events and teach them how to look after themselves and how to not be, how to help other people in what is a massive crowd with all the best will in the world. If you're in a crowd of 100,000 people and security is way over there, you're not going to get that kind of help. But I often feel, just personally, like that we are the thing that they did and the thing that everyone sees on the banners and the jumbotrons, at the big festivals, when in fact their own crews, are maybe not getting that level of attention, and yet they suffer the same sort of harassment and in many cases violence, sexual violence, as the audience members do. So,
picking up on that point then, Mel, how much do you think that festivals and venues are investing in terms of preventing sexual violence at the events? And are they doing enough?
Well, I mean, we don't get any money from them. We are quite often asked to turn up, but we fund ourselves with T-shirt sales. We're an all-volunteer organization. So, we're often fed, but there's no anything like that. In terms of money, I mean, the Association of Independent Festivals had a big campaign before the pandemic in 2018. Signing up and talking about sexual safety, and I'm sure that there was some money there, but in terms of like big funding, other than having sort of our presence at these big events, and we're just a very small organization, frankly, I don't see a lot of money, and I know the plural anecdote is not data, but often some of the comments we get, like, what about men's safety and what about the men, often come from sort of third-party security firms. And
just picking up on that, given that we have, large music festivals taking place here during the summer months. So from your opinion, do they invest enough money to make sure that women are safe at those venues? And if not, what more should they be doing?
No, I don't believe so. I believe they've made a good start from nothing, which is what existed when we came into view. But I think that a lot more could be done. I think that there could be a lot more staff awareness. There could be a lot more specific training of security and other officers on site to look after not just crowds but musicians and crew. I do think that a whole lot more could be done to make sort of sexual violence just be entirely unacceptable in live music spaces, anywhere from sort of sticky floored punk clubs all the way up to these massive festivals. And in some cases, it's a case of they don't have the money because they're quite a small organization, and with the bigger organizations, perhaps it's a case of they think that money would be better spent elsewhere, particularly post-pandemic. So.
It could be simply a matter of doing some work with security staff on doors,
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it might not require a lot of money, but it might be about, them being aware of what's going on. And you mentioned about staff and security, some of those events, but some of those people could well be the perpetrators as well, so about how you deal with some of those issues.
That's absolutely true, and we're aware that that's happened, that where security staff has been the perpetrator, and it's often left to, and people in this panel can correct me, but I go to a lot of shows and I'm there before the show because we're setting up, and it's up to sometimes the individual artist to decide what security gets briefed on. And so there are some artists, particularly if we're at the show and they're familiar with our work, who are quite good, who will make sure that the security briefing includes a briefing about sexual violence, sexual harassment. We are zero tolerance. We don't do any of that. But if they don't specifically ask for it, if the artists themselves or their management doesn't specifically ask for it, that might not happen at the individual show level. So it's very hit and miss.
And you mentioned before about, and I think some panel members also mentioned about how women don't report these incidents to the police. And what do you think needs to be done to encourage and support more women to do that? Is there a job of work to do with the police in terms of a level of understanding about these issues as well?
Well, yes. So only 7% of people who had unwanted sexual attention at a festival reported that to the festival staff, and only 2% went to the police. Depending on your genre and depending on the sort of values of the music community, a lot of people, particularly with some of the things that are happening with the Met, don't want to go to police. They don't trust that police will do anything for them or help them in any way. Equally, while there's often quite a lot of security, there's often not very many police on festival sites and at live music sites, depending on size. We often work, and we have worked in the past, although it's not our primary work, with small venues and making sure they have sexual safety policies and making sure that a bartender will know what to do if someone comes to them to say, I've just been assaulted in the bathroom at your pub, right, during a live music event. But again, it's very hit and miss, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of good guidance to police to how to deal with it in a live music setting.
Okay. Well, a lot of these venues would have to get a license from local authorities to operate. Right. Do you think there needs to be something incorporated in terms of licensing around safety of women in their venues?
That would be certainly a very good place to start, provided that the expense of it wouldn't then stop sort of grassroots music venues being able to put on a show. But yeah, that would absolutely be a very good place to start if there was some sort of central guidance for audiences and for crew. And anyone who's in their venue for a live music event, whether they're front of house or back of house, for the venue to understand, that sexual violence does happen at live music events and how they should respond to it and how they should work to prevent it in the first instance. And some venues are very good at it, and some venues aren't. So,
thank you, Mel. That's me.
Thank you, Mel. So I'm not going to ask you to name and shame. I'm going to ask you to name and celebrate. Are there any festivals that are better than others?
2000 Trees does very good work. We tend to work with Live Nation, and they have us at all of their very big festivals like Reading and Leeds, and they are doing a better job than they would have done, say, in 2015 when we started our organization. So there are some people who are definitely trying. The Association of Independent Festivals does a lot of good work with us and let us inform their sort of active bystanding advice that they gave to all of their festivals. So, it is happening, but as I say, it's a bit hit and miss across the industry.
And what, I'm going to say evidence, and I don't necessarily mean evidence, what anecdote can you give us about how well-trained security staff are? Mm-hmm. Or in some cases, are they part of the problem?
They are in some cases part of the problem, and anecdotally post-pandemic, so a lot of people worked in security, sort of, you'd see the same guy every show, right? And they were great guys and we really loved them, but we don't see them anymore because they got new jobs. They tend to be freelancers, and third parties, sometimes contract staff as well. And so what we're seeing sort of anecdotally post-pandemic is people who didn't work in live music at this level prior to pandemic because it's quite frankly a very low paid position. There's a skill shortage everywhere, and I think that skill shortage also bleeds over into security at live shows post-pandemic.
So I went to Glastonbury last summer.
Good.
A cultural experience. And it was, I visited the Gold Command and saw the police on site. It seemed to me quite a reasonably sized police presence. Is that unusual?
I haven't been to Glastonbury. I was at Left Field with Billy Bragg in 2018. He had a salon, and I haven't been since then. I don't recall seeing many police then, but then Glastonbury is such a big place. I didn't get much past that little area that we were, so I can't really say. I do see police presence at the bigger festivals, but also, if I'm honest, people will avoid police at the bigger festivals. So, I
think the comment that Avon and Somerset Police made to me was that they were very conscious that there was a massive reluctance from women to report to them.
Yes.
Which is, a huge barrier. Vic, did you want to...
I was just going to come in and say, with the Earth List, we've been working with a number of much smaller independent festivals with a programme we call Doing the Right Thing. And it's celebrating and working with festivals who want to have equally balanced stages, because so many festivals have 80-90% men on stage, and also have a much more holistic and supportive view of the safety of the attendees as well. So big shout out to Out and Wild and Under the Stars, and there's a few other, but it tends to be the boutique, 500,000, not more than 5,000 attendees, these smaller ones, and which also are predominantly run by women as well. So more women in the whole ecosystem has a much more safety impact for the musicians and the audiences and fans.
Thank you. Elliot.
Thank you very much, Chair. Vic, can I take you back to what you were saying earlier about the Equality Act? Could you expand a little bit more about how and why you think the Equality Act should be amended to better improve protections for freelance and self-employed musicians?
Because there's no recourse for someone who hasn't got an employment contract. You're outside the scope of the Equalities Act, so you can't. If you can get some legal advice, there's nothing you can do. That's it. So the freelance music workforce really needs some protection, or it needs clarified, or on exactly what sort of working contracts they would have that protection.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. And do you think that the Independent Standards Authority will be an effective way to tackle misconduct? Or is it a step in the right direction? Is it not enough? What are your sort of thoughts on that?
Now, concerns I have about it, I've been told about its development, and I understand that the music industry wants to have a something, or this organisation is going to solve harassment and discrimination in the music industry. Great. But it concerns me in a few ways, one of which is that it might interfere with someone's time period in which they can get legal advice and start proceedings. That's another. It seems to be replicating want to replicate some of the services that existing membership organisations and unions are already providing. And also it seems to me that it might be a conflict of interest that the music industry is funding an organisation that would somehow investigate itself. And it has no, I understand, proposed regulatory powers. And therefore, what powers will it have? It could do, I believe the proposal is it can do investigations and make some recommendations. And then the music company or organisation involved can go, oh, well, I'm going to ignore them.
Without any teeth from statute,
Exactly.
Words.
We've already got the Equality and Human Rights Commission, so it seems to me that I think we're treading on some territory that maybe hasn't been thought through properly.
Yeah, I saw lots of nodding from the rest of the panel. Did any of the rest of the panel want to come in on that issue about the Independent Standards Authority and whether or not it would be useful at all?
I think from my perspective, you will see similar issues and that people still will be scared to report because of losing work. That's the biggest threat, I think. So we might be replicating, as Vick was saying, things that aren't working. We might need to look at things that are new and really look at the people who are doing the work. There are some amazing organisations doing great work in these areas, and it's unfortunately, a lot of this is a societal issue. It's not just within the music industry, it's just that the music industry is primed for it to be worse. So potentially it's not, the overall best solution. And as Vick says, if people aren't actually going to, if it's just recommendations and people aren't going to do anything, there's not much teeth there.
Yeah. And Vanessa, you obviously, you raise a good point about the organisations that are already doing work in this space. Is there a way, or would you envisage a way where industry and government can better support the organisations that are already existing and doing work? And how would that look? What sort of the support do you think would, what do you think support would look like in order to bolster the work that those organisations are doing?
So I like to be realistic and pragmatic in things. I appreciate funding's always difficult topic. We've seen a lot with the Arts Council and how the funding has been spread, and levelling up has happened recently. I think making it a priority actually to impact women's and the safety of people within the music industry, actually creating a pot of funding to create that as a priority, and then the typical role of people tendering that funding and actually putting forward proposals and saying, we can do this work, this is the examples of the work we've done. Are we able to do this at a more local level and able to impact people directly and holistically?
Nadia, I saw a lot of nodding there. Did you want to come in on that too?
Yeah, I was just agreeing with what Vanessa was saying. I think and something you touched on earlier, Vanessa, about the structures of funding. Again, as Women in Control, I've self-funded everything to date, because the funding avenues that are open require me to do a women's album or a writing camp or a day away, and we want to do real work. We're wanting to do research that's actually making tangible change in the industry. The campaigning that I've done at Women in Control and the report, the Seat at the Table report that we've released, I've now working with organisations and working with women and actively doing campaigns and running campaigns to get them elected, and I've been successful in every campaign that I've run so far. But I'm putting my spare time in this. I run my own business, so I don't want to do a vanity project for let's get some women together and do an album. I work with women artists already, and we already do that stuff. So I think the funding, the way it's set up, I'm sure maybe you would all agree that it's challenging. We don't want to make up these projects to apply for a little pot of money and then go back and say what we've done when we're all really wanting to make structural change or real tangible change that's going to really benefit the industry, and we all have the knowledge and passion to do that.
I absolutely agree with that. I mentioned before that we fund ourselves with t-shirt sales. We're an all-volunteer organisation. I put so much of my own money into what we do in sort of protecting people that come to live music, which is a million, if not billion-pound industry. And I think the government is kind of leaving some money on the table for itself in forms of taxes and that by not supporting the arts this way. And by not providing the funding. So, if more women feel safe to come to shows, then they'll come to shows and they'll spend money. And, the economy goes that way. And I think that with more funding, and more women support in the arts and in music, we could, I think people are missing a trick and they're leaving money on the table by not supporting us.
And no, that's really, really helpful. Thank you for that. And I can probably guess the answer to this, Vanessa, but in promoting the Charter for Change, what sort of reaction do you get from industry? How helpful do you find them when you're trying to engage with the industry to promote that?
It really varies so wildly. So with larger organisations, we typically get actually a very positive reaction, and often they'll be working on things themselves in the background to try and make their workplace environments better and safer. They have more structure to them. They typically are more financially viable. When we're looking at studios and spaces that aren't as financially viable, they're really worried about their clientele and how they're going to react to it. So they, 50% of the studios we contacted, for instance, in the last month, of 700, out of them 340 had already closed since last year. So they really are struggling financially. So they don't want to put off their clientele, and if people are coming into the industry expecting a casual space, expecting to be able to do whatever they want in these venues, they don't want to put off those people. So that's... Yeah.
Thank you. And one last question to all of you. I mean, it seems as if, there's been a lot of grassroots organisations and voluntary organisations trying to affect change for a very long time, and yet the testimony we've had has been quite bleak, and the situation looks quite bleak. Has the time passed, do you think, for industry to try and sort this issue out without any formal direction, whether that be new legislation, whether that be new rules and regulations, a new regulator, etc., etc.? Do you think the time has passed for them, for industry, to sort this out on their own, and it's time for something with a bit more teeth? If I maybe start with Vanessa and work down the panel.
I would like it to not be the case that there would need to potentially be legislation put forward, but I don't know how realistic that is. I think there will be more movement towards it with things like this happening, because people do like the positive PR of it, but the reality is a lot of the time it is lip service and positive PR, and there's not something that's going further underneath the curtain. So it's a difficult question to answer, but...
No, thank you, that's really helpful. Nadia?
I think I touched on this a little bit earlier on, but I don't think that the industry is capable or has shown that it's willing to solve the problems that are there at the minute. And as I said before as well, it's not in one area, it's across the whole industry. And when we do reporting, we might focus in on a specific area, doing some data and research. It's difficult to have conversations because there's no one wants to take accountability, and we're not trying to blame, we're trying to make improvements. So unless there's a collective effort from the industry to put the time and investment in, then no, we'll need to come from outside sources.
I think from my perspective, sexual harassment, sexual violence is already illegal. In respect of, legislation, I too kind of think that I would hope that there doesn't need to be government intervention, and maybe that's a bit naive of me, but I think that it would be better if we had the ability, all of us here who have this expertise. I think the way that government could help us would be to help us influence the music industry, both front and back of house, rather than sort of more regulations with an industry that's kind of already on its knees trying to recover from the pandemic.
Finally, Vick, to you.
I'm all for greater amounts of regulation and strengthening the requirement to get organisations to behave. I think the having to report the pay gaps has been brilliant, because it's shone a light on what's really going on, and people then can make informed judgments. Okay, so the PR statements that this organisation puts out, how does that differ from how well women are doing in those organisations? So I would definitely like to see some expansion of that to cover organisations which are smaller. It is a problem in music because most businesses are micro businesses, but I think it wouldn't be too onerous, even if you had 20 staff, to be able to do a pay gap report. So I would definitely like to see a lot more regulation, because then people are much more likely to comply.
Thank you all very much, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether this is a question or a statement. So, Vanessa, you said something much earlier in this session about the music industry hadn't had its Me Too moment. I guess the question is, how can we empower women to speak up? And the second part of it, which is definitely a statement, is can I just thank all of you for coming, sort of formally before I've closed the meeting, because we really struggled to get women to come forward and speak up. So I know that it takes courage and bravery. So thank you for being here this afternoon. I think it has made a big difference to us to be able to hear from you. But is there anything more that can be done to empower women to be brave enough to come forward?
It is really difficult because it's difficult to disclose regardless of whether you're in the music industry or not. But I do think, so this week Ray released an album after leaving a major label quite publicly a couple of years ago. She released My 21st Century Blues, and on the album there's a song called Ice Cream Man, which talks very openly about an experience that she has had. So I actually think people like Ray being brave enough to speak about those issues and being so public facing, and hopefully she will get number one with this album, those are the sorts of things that can help.
Yeah.
Thank you. Kim's got a final question for you now.
Sorry, and I meant to ask the question earlier, and I'm sorry, but it goes back to music and lyrics and misogyny. And there's an assertion that black music and genres get over-scrutinised, and I just wanted to know whether you thought that was the case and what should be done about it.
Yes, I definitely do.
I think my understanding of the research is that it's across pop music in general, well, and even as we discussed earlier, in folk, and look at classical opera. There's a woman is murdered in just about every opera I've ever seen. So I think it's a problem across the board, and I think you're right that black music genres have face more scrutiny.
Thanks. And last question to you, Nadia. Your report resulted in more black women, sitting on boards. And I think that is a great step, and just wanted to know whether you thought that was going to have an impact going forward in terms of encouraging more women to come forward and be brave, because that's what it's about, isn't it? Unfortunately, having the bravery to stand up and put your head over the parapet, to call out, these terrible acts.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, it's a very similar conversation to every woman when I'm talking about them going forward for a board position. I don't see, maybe I'll go onto the website and then they'll see the makeup of the board already, and it's really off-putting to see, we call it male, pale and stale, a kind of board looking back at you, and you feel, how do I fit in there? Will I be listened to? So you already have to overcome these barriers, and we talk a lot about women in the industry lacking confidence or imposter syndrome, whereas I see it as the imposter syndrome is created by the systems, that you don't feel welcome to go into those rooms. So a lot of the work, and I will tell you, every single woman that I've ever spoken to and convinced to go forward for a board, it's been an hour or two conversation to explain why they should go for it, and it is challenging and it is difficult. And when you're doing this kind of work as well, movement is really slow at those top levels as well. And I think we had a conversation when I was putting the report out, and you said something about, you have to keep on every year. In the report, out of 12 CEOs, there were 3 women that were CEOs at the time, but if one woman leaves, then that number reduces drastically. So it's ongoing work, and it's very challenging for a woman to step forward into those roles and be the first or be the only woman.
Just say, when women do get onto these very senior positions, they don't stay in those positions for as long as the men do, and that's another problem as well. It's not just about promoting, it's about retaining and ensuring that they can succeed in those roles.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, panel, for great responses to our questions today. Thanks very much.
If there's anything that you wanted to add in writing, please do. If there's anything that you think we have failed to ask you or you suddenly remember, then please do feed it in afterwards. We'd be very pleased to receive it. Thank you very much for your evidence. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.